Hello, my name is Lev Melik, and I'm recording this video as a subtopic for our weekly meetings. Every Tuesday, as you know, we have a group that discusses all sorts of things, oftentimes on Torah, oftentimes outside of Torah. How are you? How things are? And our group meets every Tuesday at 8 o'clock Israeli time, 1 o'clock US time every Tuesday, 6 o'clock, I guess, London time. And we cover a variety of topics. And our approach is not to impose opinions, not to criticize opinions, not to say how silly or stupid it is, but rather to exchange opinions, to say, well, that's how I see things, that's how you see things, and let me try to understand your view. So very non-confrontational. We try to be not confrontational. Sometimes our emotions flare up a little bit, and maybe I guess it's a human nature, but generally we try to be kind to each other and respectful to whatever opinion somebody might have. We have people in our group of variety of backgrounds. Some are on the extreme right of the spectrum, some on the extreme left of the spectrum, some are not on the spectrum at all, some religious, some not. So we talked, the reason I'm recording this particular note is that we have discussed, we discussed the historical occurrences of the Jewish thought. And we talked about Kabbalah, we talked about the Torah, oral Torah, written Torah. We talked about how Tanaims, Amoraim, and Acharonim, Rashi, Ramban. We're going to talk about Vilna Gaon coming up soon. We have a speaker lined up. So for our 40 minutes presentations, we have some maybe introductory topic. We call it 14 minutes presentation. It's always difficult to condense a lot of years or hours of knowledge that some expert in a particular topic might have and present it in a short format to a group that may not have the diversity and breadth and width of the background to absorb a lot of analytical work, and a summary, a simplified approach is perhaps more appropriate for our group many times. So we talked about one of our friends, one of the perplexed friends, Adrian, oftentimes he brings very good questions, and sometimes, in many cases, I personally don't have an answer, so I have to go ask somebody else. And even then, I may not have an answer. So one of the things Adrian asked, and I specifically want to address it to Adrian, not to convince, but just to share what I've learned so far. And I will ask our friend David Moran from Beersheba to help with a Hebrew, because a couple of things that I present have Hebrew writings, which I'm not very strong at, and David may record similar note or explain it to our group next Tuesday, if possible, to clarify some of the things that I will say, if I perhaps mistaken a little bit or mistranslated somewhat, whatnot. David oftentimes jumps in and helps me with a Hebrew to correct if I misspeak on some things or incorrectly quote, whatnot. So we're working out a very good alliance of Adrian many times challenging the conventional views. I oftentimes try to explain. David corrects my explanations. Other guys, Reuven, Menachem Mendel, John, jump in and add some other nuances to that. So we get a very dynamic and interesting conversation. So jumping right to the topic. Instead of doing overall saying, well, I don't care what our sage is saying, what do they know, what basis they got it all from. Those type of statements usually don't lead anywhere. Generalities. If I'll tell to my friend Adrian that has 40 years experience in medical field as a doctor, specializes in liver, that I don't believe in any of this liver medicines. Well, what he can tell me how much experience do I have as a doctor in liver? Zero. And I would question, to me, liver just maybe somewhere in the ear. How do I know it's really inside of me? So the same thing also when we ask the questions generally, generically, it's very difficult to answer generic questions. I don't believe the earth is flat or round or this or that. It's very generic. But if you break it down to a specific point of your question, maybe it's easier to handle. So the topic here of Rashi is on which basis, when Rashi is a most commonly used commentator of the Torah, Rambam, Azar, Ibn Ezra, many, but Rashi is kind of a known authority. So if we would question, well, how does Rashi know that? It's a good question that deserves some understanding. Well, if Rashi said that's what Torah means, well, that must be, that's what it means. Well, it's not good enough explanation. To somebody who had learned Torah maybe from childhood for 50, 60 years and learned lots of books, they understand Rashi's logic. But for someone, let's say like myself, who didn't grow up religious necessarily, it's naturally for me, I mean, I haven't gone to a synagogue, didn't read a small fraction of what other people have read and studied. And therefore, I need more simplified explanations since I have missed perhaps my opportunity to spend time with people who know more than me. And therefore, when I meet people sometimes now, instead of acknowledging how much people know, and maybe I don't have a chance or patience to sit down and understand, it's easy for me just to brush it off, say, oh, how did I know that? So I am now visiting US. I live in Baal Shem. I'm visiting US of my family, been to Atlanta, Philadelphia, New York, and now I'm in Muncie, visiting some good friends of mine, good friends that are Satmars. We used to be in the same synagogue in Atlanta, and they moved to Muncie, very, as you know, a very Hassidish area, a lot of Satmars, Belts, and other Hasidim. So I went to the synagogue yesterday. Today is actually Friday morning in US in front of the Shavuot. So maybe this is a all-night studies that people do on Shavuot, which is from Saturday night until Sunday. That's the Shavuot begins, Shavuot. In America, it's 2 days, in Israel, 1. So it was very appropriate for me to kind of learn. This is part of the learning that we do on Shavuot. So I can dedicate it to Shavuot, and hopefully you guys will enjoy it. So I asked in the synagogue, it's called the synagogue. I went to Satmar Synagogue, Nikolsburg Synagogue. Nikolsburg is from, I believe, from Hungary somewhere. The Satmar from Hungary, and that's not in a Satmar village, but Nikolsburg Rebbe, and his descendants, now one of his descendants is the head of the synagogue. He's the Rebbe of the synagogue. So I talked to him and a couple of other people, and then, of course, I didn't have the chance to sit down and have a big discussion with the Rebbe. He's busy, but I asked a relatively quickly question, and he immediately opened up the door and pointed to me the explanation. And I went back to the books that he pointed, and on my own this morning did some study, which I want to share with you. So anyway, that is how, this is just one small example how Rashi bases his comment. So it's not that Rashi is just open to Torah and something, and of course in the written Torah, we, people who believe in oral Torah and the written Torah jointly, believe that oral Torah and its expanded explanation on the written Torah. The written Torah is kind of like a summary, which really not that easy to understand every detail unless you have some explanation. Oral Torah is the explanation. Moses spent 80 days on Mount Sinai for the reason, if we believe that Moses did spend 80 days on Mount Sinai. So if you believe the Torah is the divinely inspired, divinely given, that's what the Torah says. Moses was on the mountain. 40 days the first time, 40 days the second time. So if he was there for 80 days, what was he doing for 80 days? If he just had to go and get the Torah and come back down, well, it takes 5 minutes. Go to a library, get a book, and go home. For 80 days, he discussed something in motion. So if you believe the Torah basically reflection of that, even though people who feel Torah was not given to us on Sinai, but it was written 500 years later by somebody, or thousands later, or whenever. But as long as it's written with some kind of inspiration of God, it's still divine document. So you believe it regardless whether it was given on Sinai, or maybe later on somebody wrote it, but still expressing the God's will. Then doesn't matter. We look in Torah today and basically use the same rationale. Rashi, Rambam, Rambans are using. If you don't believe the Torah is given on Sinai or later, if you feel that somebody just sat down at some point and just put together a nice series of fables, fairy tales, nice, good, maybe Jewish history. Well, if you believe in that, then you may as well turn off here and go study maybe biology or science or something. Then it's probably not for you. But if you're interested, if you want to understand at least a different view on that, the Torah is divinely inspired, then you can continue listening to my little presentation here. So Rashi basically does not come to his own, just sitting there reading the Torah and saying, well, I think it probably means there were the 3 angels, not 4. That's what Rashi says. Rashi doesn't do that. Rashi uses several methods. One, he would say that basically that's what his teacher or teachers told him. He just conveys that. That's rare in Rashi, but sometimes just simply Rashi comments, that's what teachers told him, and he just expands. Why would he say that? Wouldn't we be able on our own? We could, but Rashi wants to share with him the background information that he has, that his teachers gave him, he presents to us, because he feels this particular topic, this particular subject may not be something that's too simple. He is the authority, genius in learning. He sat and learned Torah all day long. He does feel, I assume, he does feel that he knows more than somebody like me, who does machinery, pumps, technology, and then occasionally studies Torah. So he feels he will do me a favor if he'll share with me a wealth of information, of knowledge that he has learned all his life. So he presents that for me to believe it or not. So that's one way. He shares with me something he thinks I might miss if I read it on my own. So he tries to help me. That's one way, relatively small portion of Rashi logic. The second logic is Rashi will say, Midrash says that, or Kabbalah said that. And based on what Kabbalah said, that is how that chapter lines up with Kabbalah or with Midrash. He just presents what Midrash said, and he reflects that into the Torah. That's the second way. The third way of Rashi's comments, another type of comments Rashi presents, is Rashi would say that comes from Talmud such and such portion, and he presents the portion, and if you go to the Talmud and read it somewhere there, you will see sometimes in a debatable form, Rabbi Akiva is arguing Rabbi Eliezer about a certain explanation, and if you believe in oral Torah and the Talmud and a debate between, if you believe that there was such a guy, the Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer, and then they have a debate, because this is how teachers of Rabbi Akiva translated to him, and teacher of Rabbi Eliezer translated that to him, and sometimes, yes, translation, transmittal might have been not exactly the same. So times comparing that transmissions and trying to reconcile. So if one says, I see it this way, and another one says, I see it that way, it's usually not a contradiction, which one is right. But one says, well, you have to go to the right. No, my teacher told me go to the left. And after analysis, a little bit of debate, they come to the explanation that on Tuesdays you go to the right, or on Wednesdays you go to the left. So the objective of the debate between Tanaim is not to contradict each other, but to find what are we missing? What is a common denominator that reconciles our views, and that reconciliation comes out from their discussion. So there's a harmony of opinions together, not a contradiction. Actually, what the Mishnah present and Gemara, Talmud expound on and explain. So let me jump now to take one example. So example we'll do is this is what I did. Let me just share the screen. Technology. How do I share the screen here? So I hope you share the screen. So this is a picture of this Nicholasburg synagogue, Satmar synagogue that I went. And that's a picture from the inside of it, and people studying. So I put my talis into tefillah and I did my shachrit. And lots of books. Well, if I would read only 100% of what these people learn, of those books, I would consider myself lucky and somewhat knowledgeable. So I picked up 3 of these books. One you can see is basically Chumash. The second one, the 5 books of Moses. The second one is one of the books in more expanded format printing, happens to be Bamidbar. And then also Masechta in Talmud on Pesachim. And this is, I opened in the pages. The one above is from a Torah, the one below from expanded Torah commentaries. And then to the left is from Pesachim. So let's look at Torah first. So I look at the expanded portion. This is Merkayot Gedolot. And David, please help me to correct my horrible Hebrew accent. And in it, if I will make it a little bit bigger, let's zoom. It talks about second Pesach. So if somebody missed the Pesach because either he was tamei, ritual and clean, or he was away, he was far away. So if he was far away, and the Torah describes in Bamidbar, Numbers, what happens? People came to Moses and says, listen, we were tamei, we were too far, whatever. We couldn't get to participate in Pesach, so Moshe consulted with God, and God says, next month they have an opportunity to make up. It will not be a full-blown Pesach for 7 days. It's only one day. They can have actually chometz, but they have to bring the korban. They missed bringing korban. So Rashi explains right here. This is, I'm pointing with a expanded view. You see this is Tzadi Gimel, which Rashi says, or bederech rechoka. If he was too far, what is far? A mile, 10 miles, 5 yards? How far is far? How do you explain what's far is? Rashi says, how do we understand far? And then Rashi says that explanation on the distance is in Pesachim Zayin Gimel. So go Pesachim Zayin Gimel and you see explanation. Okay, so we'll follow Rashi. We'll say, fine, we'll go there. So we'll go to Pesachim, and this is also for David Moran to help me a little bit. And here's a debate. This is Rabbi Akiva disputes with Rabbi Eliezer. And one says that far is approximately distance like from Modin to Jerusalem. So you happen to go from Haifa, you got to Modin. Modin is near maybe right now, maybe 15 minutes drive from Jerusalem, something like that. That's Modin is, between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. So if you are distance of Modin, or the radius of the distance, maybe 5 miles, let's say. If you're on that distance, you are outside with too far. So if you travel from Haifa and you came at a time, I think it's roughly by the afternoon or the 14th of Nisan before Pesach, if you didn't have a chance to bring your animal to Shechted as a sacrifice, you lost an opportunity. You're too late. You're late. So if you're traveling for Haifa and you are already in Modin, well before Modin, and you didn't get quite to the temple, too late. Then, if you have a good reasons, you can come next month, and the sacrifice will be accepted next month. And that's what they did. And that's when Rabbi Eliezer here is saying, no, it's not that far. It's even if you're outside the temple mount, outside the temple, Beit HaMikdash, if you're outside of there, too late. You're traveling from Beersheba, from Haifa or somewhere, you got it there, and it's 12:01, and you still have 5 meters to go. Sorry, office is closed, sacrifice is no longer accepted, you missed it. You can say, well, how can it be? The person traveled so far, and then he still didn't get closed. Sorry, we're closed. 5 o'clock, everybody goes home, you're too late. Next time, put your alarm clock and get up earlier and get to the temple. So that is how the debate about codes come to Pesachim. Now you can say, how do they know? Which one knows what's close and what's not close? Then you go to the next source from there. And that's the second thing. Okay, now you're going to okay, I didn't lose the Pesachim. All right. The note from Pesachim points to the interpretation of the distance. And the distance in the Torah, that distance, rachoka, has, the word has a dot over kuf. Where is it in my notes? That's in the previous, let's see, here. Let me see, I'm looking. Okay, help me out, guys. Here it is. See it? Resh, Het, Kuf, Hey. There's a dot over Kuf. The Torah rules are, and now we'll get to where these rooms come from. If you look in the Torah, this is of course print, but if you look in the Torah itself, none of these symbols are in it on the scroll, but the dots, some special symbols over the letters, do exist in the Torah itself. In this case, only Kuf has a dot. Resh, Het, and Hey do not. That big dot is not part of what appears in the Torah. So if the rule is, and we get to how to come to these rules, if you have a word that majority of the letters do not have the kuf, the dot, we read the word. If let's say the word has 4 letters and 3 of them have dots, we pay attention to the letters. Essentially, we say it's like diminishes the word, and we have to read the second meaning of the word as if the letters with the dot do not exist. In this case, if the dot was not to be read, you would read it racha, not rachaka. So again, if there's more dots, if the majority of letters have dots over them, they're significant. If the dots are minority, or if majority of letters do not have dots, and a minority of letters do have dots, then we do not pay attention to the dots and read the entire word. Okay, this is a rule. So just illustrated with an example. If you look now into Breshit, you look at Breshit, and let's take a look at this. Here it is. That's in Vayera, when Abraham comes in, and when angels come to visit Abraham, and he is with Sarah, and Sarah is listening from the tent, and Malachim tell him, Vayomru, and they told Aleph, Lamed, Yud, Vav. You notice that there's a dot over Aleph, over Yud, and over Vav, but there is no dot. Those 2 dots are not present in the scroll of Torah. So majority of the letters, Aleph, Yud, and Vav, have dots. The Lamed does not have. If majority of the letters have it, we expound the Yod. We do not diminish the Yod. In the previous example, there's only one dot, remember? So we diminish it. So we make the distance smaller. It's from the outside the temple. If you're far, meaning outside the temple. If you didn't diminish the word, the distance would have been all the way to Modi. So we take diminish, in this case, 3 dots of the 4 letters. So majority of letters have dots. Therefore, we read it. We read that letter as both Elyo, Elav, and Elai, to him and to her. And Beraisa, let's also have reference to Beraisa. Let's say next page, I'll check, so David can check it for us. Okay, that's the next page, final page. That's more on Rashi. So when David reviews it, he can freeze it and do it and get his comments to it. So in this case, when the angels came and they mentioned to Abraham, where is your Sarah, your wife? They also mentioned that to Sarah, where is your husband? And the meaning of that, Beraisa explained that angels knew where Sarah is. They didn't have to ask Abraham, but he comments to Abraham, how nice is your family? You have shniyas, you have nice manners at home, good spiritual family. The lady is taking care of business, she's preparing food, she's taking care of household, she's modest, and that's what saying, where is your wife? She mentioned also to Sarah, where is your husband, which is derivation from this word, meaning your husband is a nice man, hospitable man, is now receiving the guests. So you both playing very important role in the family, receiving guests. And that's a lesson to all of us to be open and hospitable to guests. Now, there's much more to be said about that. I'm not a rabbi to get all the nuances of this passage, but I just want to bring to you what, how the Rashi comes into why the distance is short. He takes it now from the dots. In Pesach, he goes to Pesachim. Pesachim had dispute with the Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer. Do you read the dots or you don't read the dots? If you read the dots, then the dots will explain to you that the distance is short. And another example where the dots are used in Torah in many other places. And this is just another example of Brishit. How do we use the dots? The next question comes in. Of course, this is my discussion with Adrian on his question. How does Rashi come up with that? Is it his own thoughts? Well, it's not his own thoughts. As you probably see from what I just said, it's not, he just came up with it. He derived it from the Torah, from the Midrashim, from the Talmud, from the Mishnah, and so forth. One side comment I forgot to mention, in the early days, Mishnah was printed as a separate book. Even today, there's a Mishnah that's printed separate edition. Talmud, which is Mishnah and Gemara, are relatively recent editions. They're printed like kids. When a religious community begin to study oral Torah, they read Mishnah first, just to see what Mishnah says, without Talmud, Gemara explaining all the details. So when they're reading the Mishnah, and they're a little bit unclear what's going on, Rashi is telling them, well, when you get to learn the Gemara, when you grow up a little bit, then you will come across this passage. But just jumping ahead, let me try to explain this difficult passage of Mishnah, because you don't have a Gemara right in front of you. When people in more advanced age learn Talmud, Mishnah, and Gemara, then it might become clear to them even without Rashi's help. As they read on from Mishnah to Gemara, they come across this explanation, it will become clear to them. But because Rashi doesn't know who will be reading this book, more knowledgeable people, less knowledgeable people, he makes his comment, and his comment is reflected now in a printed volume of not just Mishnah, but on Talmud, which is Mishnah and Gemara together. That's just one small point why Rashi is making a comment, a technical comment, to help you out to understand. But again, he is not just dreaming it up on his own in his genius is head. He is much more genius than all of us, so to speak. That's not what we're saying. We're saying Rashi has a strong derivations, and this is what he comes from. Now, you may say to me, okay, so you're basically now telling me that Rashi comes in from these dots in the Torah scroll that point to particular idea. Well, I don't believe in the dots in the Torah. I don't believe in the Torah. Torah was written by the guys. If you take that position, well, if you believe that position, not much can be said except the one thing. This is what somebody mentioned this morning to me. We Jews are skeptical by nature. We don't believe in other religions, Christianity, Islam, Hindu, not because it's right religion, it's the wrong religion. That's not for me to comment, but because it's not convincing enough for us Jews. Muhammad saw the angel Gabriel, he said something, maybe he was dreaming. Who else was the witnesses? It was only him and the prophet. Muslims believe into that, more power to them. If they believe it, fine. We Jews are skeptical. One guy, how do we know? Christianity too. One guy came in and he revealed himself to the humanity. One guy, maybe he had too much to drink, maybe he had this. We can do it. We can be kind of, I don't mean disrespectful to other religions, but we just are skeptical. But if we, in our tradition, if Torah was witnessed by 600 men from 20 to 60, that means people over 60, their grandparents were still there, kids until 20s were there, women. So the total number of people was 3 million. So if 3 million witnessed all that, then you can say, how do we know that? And that also Torah came up with that. Well, if the Torah was a fictitious document written by one guy, a couple of guys, we Jews are skeptics. We would know over the centuries. This is, I don't know, doesn't sound right to me. I don't believe in that. But majority of the Jews over the century believed in it and followed it very, very strongly. And in our modern age, people, there's a big percentage of people that say, I don't buy. Well, you don't buy, you don't buy. But majority of people believed it. Very, very smart people believe that. So the Rebbe I asked today told me, no, Lev, the Torah is not based on faith, because until that point I thought it's ultimately faith. You believe it if you don't. If you believe it, that's God. If you don't believe it, go in a different category. He says, no. It's not based on faith. It is believed on factual data. So I said to him, that's a shock to me. Factual data, where are the facts? And he said, well, now you have to think about what is fact? What are the facts? What is a factual data? What is a factual data? So is it something that the sky has to physically open and the God had to reach out and tell me this is what I have? Well, he says, well, God presented himself to us twice. One time splitting the sea and next time a Sinai. You can say, and he tells me the story that this doctor comes in from, let's say he comes from America to Israel and he brings the certificates, he wants to be a doctor, or from France to Israel, from France to Spain, whatever. And the commission that examines his credentials saying, well, how do we know you can practice medicine here? The guy says, I have a diploma here. In 1967, I got a diploma. In 1973, I got another diploma. I have a bunch of certificates. At the neurosurgeon in Cambridge University, and I was doing this and this. So they look at it and say, well, it's like, this is 35 years ago, this is 27 years ago. How do we know how long time ago it was? How long time ago? How do we know it's really true? It's for a long time. We don't know. I wasn't there. And the guy said, are you guys crazy? This is my credentials. I went to all the schools, New York, Cambridge, London, Paris, Moscow, you name it. So he says, you have to take another test. He says, I don't have to get another test. I've taken millions of tests. I have so many courses. Another test, look at my credentials. So the point here is, God says, you want to get another proof? I gave you a proof in splitting of the sea. I gave you proofs in Sinai. You're asking for more proof. You're asking the doctor to show him another certificate to get another exam today. I already passed this exam. And we believed it. Most people believed it because our fathers were told by their fathers, by their fathers, grandfathers, on and on and on. And it's not just one guy got this tradition all the way from Moses. There are many people who live in Singapore, Jews, or in India, or in Barbados, or in Spain. They got the tradition from their fathers and grandfathers. Millions of people get the same tradition. So we got today the same tradition passed on through a generation by their fathers and their fathers, by multiple, by thousands, millions of people, not just but one guy. You can say, how did this guy, who knows that 5 generations back, 10 generations back, his grandfather just concocted the stuff, and from there on, nobody knows. Well, if he was the only one guy, it might have been possible, but if that was happens to 1,000 millions of people, and they all came up to the copy of the Torah in Singapore, being the same as in Zimbabwe and the same as in Norway, makes you wonder, how can the skeptical Jews come up to the same document from multiple places? So again, this is not to convince anybody. I'm not a good convincer. I'm not trying to convince, but I just want to share with you a little bit of logic, and I leave it up to you to fill the blanks and make corrections. And if you still remain skeptical, I don't buy any of that, then no, I'm not selling anything. But I asked the question, so I'm hoping that will explain how Rashi comes to this logic. If you don't believe in the Torah, you don't believe it's like this, then of course all that domino falls down and you don't have to do anything. But at least I think you have to agree that maybe Rashi was wrong by saying that Torah is divine, but at least you have to say that it is not Rashi's own thought. That's Rashi analyzing sources, the Torah, the Talmud, the Mishnah, and presenting this analysis as it existed, as it just demonstrated you, and not something came out with his head when he happened to be walking through his vineyard with a glass of wine, and you're thinking all sorts of ideas and just say, that's just what it seems to me. Let me write it down and see what people think about it. That is not Rashi. That type of ascribing to Rashi, this type of logic and methods is, I think, too naive and too superficial. But you can disagree if you don't think that it's too naive. Maybe you know more than, certainly than me, certainly than all the books that I show you. And if you do, then I guess you know better. Last story I'll tell you, they told me before we wrap it up for your Shavuot studies. This is in Russia in the Soviet days. The Jewish guy comes in to the bar. And the reason he tells the story is because many years later, he comes to the synagogue. He's an 8-year-old guy. He comes to the synagogue and sits and listens. And Rabbi is asking him, nice to meet you, sir. What's your name? Chaim. Are you sitting here? Very nice. Do you understand what we're talking about? He says, no, I don't understand English. I don't understand Hebrew. I don't understand Yiddish. And so I don't. So why are you here? He says, I'm here because, let me tell you the story. So he says, when I was a young man in Moscow, I was sitting and drinking at the bar. There was a bunch of guys, or Jewish guys, or non-Jewish guys, who were all sitting in the bar and drinking. I wasn't very observant. I wasn't religious at all. Comes in this guys, KGB, and they arrest everybody. There was 50 of us. They arrest everybody. And I spent 2 years in prison. Eventually, thank God, they released me, but they arrested me. And it turned out that there was 3 counter-revolutionists in the bar. KGB were after them. So they came in and they didn't know exactly who is who. They got everybody arrested. Might as well get everybody arrested. So I figured I had nothing to do with it. And they arrested me anyway. And the guys who had something to do with us were right there. Why did they arrest me and everybody else with them? So I figured now, I come in here, you learning Torah. You understand what's going on here. I don't. But when I die in 120 years, hopefully, and I go up to heaven, hope I get to heaven, and I go to God, and God says, how did you do? I said, I don't know. But God says, well, you did well. You were sitting at the Torah studies and you're learning. So everybody else who does it, they all make it. So do you. You didn't understand everything, but you get credit for just being sitting there and listening and learning. And that is, now let me unshare the screen. How are they doing? Yeah. Stop sharing this. So back to my note here. So this is a little bit on the Rashi, a little bit of a historical background, and I hope you like it. And I hope on Tuesday, next Tuesday, what day would it be? Next Tuesday, Mizrach Hashem, that will be, today is the day before Shabbat, Friday, the 3rd of June, 2022. So that will be then, the Tuesday will be, let's see, 5 is Saturday, 6 is, no, 4 is Saturday, 5 is Sunday, 6 Monday, 7. On the 7th of June at 8 o'clock Israeli time, let's talk about it. I want to hear what you guys would say. Agree or disagree or add, correct, look forward to that. David, please help with the Hebrew to clarify it. And maybe if you can, maybe send us a note of kind of summarizing some of the points that in the Hebrew that I presented that I might have misquoted slightly or maybe read a little bit incorrectly. So I look forward to your help on that, David, as well. Thank you, guys, and Hag Sameach, good Shabbat, and Shabbat Shalom.